Professor Eisenman.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Well, what we're treating here is a vast subject, and I find in the Western world, in any event, very little familiarity with it. So what I would like to do, if you'll permit me, is to go back over the broad sweep of history, to try to explain to you, in the first place, how the Jews and the Muslims got to Spain, what the effect of their coming there was, and what the cultural achievements that they brought with them that in fact fueled the scientific and intellectual fervor in the backgrounds of that country, leading not only to Columbus's voyages, but many of the other voyages that were being undertaken at the same time and in the same period. So what I would like to do is explain first of all for you is how, for instance, the Jews got to Spain. The Jews actually came to Spain at a very early time. It isn't clear whether Phoenicians and Jews can really be distinguished from each other. If you know the Bible at all, you will recall that King Solomon, the fabled builder of the temple in Jerusalem in about 1950 BC, was married to the daughter of Hiram of Tyre. Hiram of Tyre is a Phoenician. So the Jews and the Phoenicians, in fact, Hiram of Tyre helped in the construction of Solomon's temple. So the Jews and the Phoenicians were very closely connected very early on, and we know about the Phoenician commercial voyages across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and finally into Spain. And many of the early colonies that were put down by the Phoenicians in this 1000 BC period that we are talking about. So when we're speaking about, for instance, a Phoenician colony like Carthage, or some of the colonies along the southern coast of Spain, we are also probably speaking about the first Jewish penetration of Spain at the same time. So we go back to 1000 BC there. Later on, it is probable that Jewish merchants and commercial people came into Spain along with the Roman legions. So you get this pretty early Jewish penetration in Spain. Now, as far as the Muslims go, we should probably first trace how Spain was on the eve of the Muslim conquest. If you're familiar at all with Roman history, you will remember that the so-called Goths, the Visigoths, and if you think where these people came from, the Goths were a Nordic people, a Germanic people. In fact, there's a city today in Sweden named after the Goths, Gothenburg, if you've heard of it. So really you have to think of these people as northern Germanic Teutonic tribesmen of some kind. The Visigoths sacked Rome in the early 400s, among other barbarian groups, barbarians so-called by the Roman writers. But in any case, many of these groups were sent on to Spain and further on. One of the earlier groups that sacked Rome, that was sent on into Spain by the Romans. In other words, the Romans, to a certain extent, bought these groups off. They suggested or bribed them to consider that it was more propitious to move on to Spain and North Africa. One of the earlier groups were the Vandals, if you've heard of them. They sacked Rome in the late 300s. And it is the Vandals that gave their name to Islamic Spain. For instance, the Vandals would have gone on through Spain in the late 300s and on into North Africa, which was considered the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So the Vandals would have gone into North Africa, and when the Arab armies came through and they met the remnants of Vandals in Tunisia and these other areas of North Africa, the breadbasket, former breadbasket of the Roman Empire, they would have found out that the Vandals, the Undals, as they rephrased it, came from the direction of Spain. So in time, Al-Andalus became associated with Spain in their mind, and the name for Islamic Spain was Al-Andalus, as it's come into English through Spanish, Andalusia. So you see that you do have these kind of interesting side effects of the Muslim presence right from the beginning, even in the name, the classical name for Muslim Spain, and one of the most romantic names because of the music associated with it. I think in the English vocabulary, Andalusia evokes tremendously romantic ideas of poetry and music and fabled nights in gardens where fountains flow, I think, and lovely guitar music also. In any event, the next group were the Visigoths. They were directed into Spain by the Romans, and they were not Christian at this point. Ultimately, in the late 400s and 500s, they were Christianized. And as all new converts to a certain faith, they often were more zealous than the people who converted them. So they were extremely zealous Christians in the early 600s, and along with their zeal came a good deal of intolerance. This intolerance was later to reassert itself when Spain, 900 years later, was reconquered in the process that I will tell you about called the Reconquista. And when Spain 900 years later was reconquered, the intolerant zeal of the Visigoths, who had just been converted to Christianity in the early 600s, moved into what we presently know as the Inquisition and the ultimate expulsion of both Jews and Arabs from Muslim, now in the late 1400s, at the time of Columbus's voyage, Christian Spain. So we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about this Visigoth experience then in Spain. This intolerance, where there were actually laws passed against minorities and non-Christian groups, and which made it almost difficult or impossible for them, very difficult or almost impossible to function in the society, created a lot of dissatisfaction, discontent, and so on. This paved the way for the eruption of the Muslim armies into Spain. And when the Muslim armies finally did come into Spain, the eruption was seen in terms of almost a Jewish-Muslim collaboration. For the Christian side, the Jews, to a certain extent, because of the situation they were in the 600s, had connived at the Muslim occupation, success, and presence in Spain. And in fact, the Jews certainly thrived under the Muslim occupation and presence in Spain. And that is contrary to what most people would think, because of the present day, people think that the Jews and the Muslims have some hostility or antagonism with each other. That was not the case in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, as it turned out, medieval Islam was far more tolerant than the kind of Christianity that I've just outlined that was adopted by the Visigoths prior to the Muslim conquest in the 600s. Let me quickly trace where the Muslims came from so we can see how they got to Spain, and that will bring us to some of the cultural things that we need to look at in order to understand how the revival of learning affected the atmosphere for the final fruition that you are all studying in this course. The Muslims, as you know, began in Mecca in the early 600s. Muhammad's mission is 612 beginning, 622 is his flight from Mecca to Medina that marks the beginning of the Islamic community. Muhammad's death is 632. In the 630s and 40s, the Muslim armies, following his death, move up into Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Persia, and so on. At the same time, a caliphate is formed. A caliphate is the word in Arabic for Khalifa, means successor. Caliph is the English word that approximates Khalifa. The caliphate are the successors to the prophet. Originally, there were some religious companions of Muhammad who were the caliphs from 632 to the 660 period. But at that point, owing to some internecine warfare within the Islamic community itself, the former aristocracy of Mecca reasserted itself and took over what was called their caliphate, and that was switched to Damascus. That was known as the Umayyad Caliphate. Now the Umayyad Caliphate was formerly, and this is very important to try to keep in your mind because for Spanish history it's tremendously important. I know these names might sound a bit abstruse to you, but it's extremely important to try to fix that name in your mind, because it's under the Umayyads in Spain that we get the flowering of Spanish Arab culture. And it's important to understand how you got Umayyads in Spain. So originally, this was the cultural and religious aristocracy of the city of Mecca, where the Prophet came. Then in various struggles from 661 onwards, it reasserted itself, and it moved the center of the Islamic Empire to Damascus in Syria, which now became known as the Umayyad Caliphate. Under this Umayyad Caliphate, the Arab conquering armies really took off. Armies moved eastward as far as India by 710. Armies moved westward with reverses, but still westward, fighting Berbers and others. That's where they came upon these Andals, these Vandals, these Andals, from whom they took the name Al-Andalus from. These armies moved across North Africa, and by 680 they had reached Morocco. You know, Morocco is a word that we get from the medieval usage, Moor. You know, Arabs were always called Moors. And we also have the name of the country next to Morocco, Mauritania. These names have remained. In fact, I think that the Moors are not quite what we would call Arabs. The Moors are really more native Berber people, but in time, as Arab civilization washed across North Africa and the Arab language with it, all began to be looked upon as quasi-Arabs, although there are still some differences from native Moors, Mauritania, Berbers, and what you would call Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula proper and other of the satellite areas spinning out from the Arabian Peninsula. In any event, by 680 the Arabs were in all the way across North Africa. In 710, after some dislocations in the Umayyad Caliphate itself, and things were restored to a certain harmony there, the decision was made by the Muslim governor of North Africa, his name was Musa ibn Nusayr, to send the Arab armies across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. You know the name of that governor? The governor's assistant who led the Arab armies into Spain is named after him. That's another of these names that come into Western folklore. His name was Tariq. He was a Berber freedman, and he led the Muslim armies into Spain, and Gibraltar is an Arab name commemorating him. Jebel, meaning mountain, Jebel Tariq, Gibraltar. Jebel Tariq, Gibraltar. These armies went into Spain in 710, led by this chieftain, and they moved very quickly into Spain. There was very little resistance because of this dissension in the Christian ranks, and the Muslim conquest was fairly lightning speed. So by the 720s, the whole country more or less had fallen into Arab hands, except for the northeast corner. The northeast corner is where the Christian resistance expressed itself and slowly coalesced. And the Reconquista, the reconquest as it's called in Christian history, the reconquest almost began simultaneously with the conquest. The Christian pocket in northeastern Spain, in northwestern Spain was left there. And the Arab armies moved into the Pyrenees and on into France along the Riviera. And if you know anything about French culture at this period, you get all the romantic songs and poems of French culture reflecting the struggle with the so-called Saracens in the Pyrenees, the Song of Roland. How many have heard of that? The Chanson du Roland, the Chanson du Geste, etc. All of these cultural remnants are glorifying this period of French arms as they resisted the Muslim conquest in the Pyrenees going into France is reflected in some of these French cultural masterpieces. Well, the one moment that Western culture is riveted on, is 732. 732, you may have learned in your classes, is the date that Charles Martel, the father of Charlemagne, stopped the Arab armies at Tours, also called the Battle of Poitiers, in north-central France, perhaps 100 miles south of Paris. And in the Western mind, that is where the Muslim tide stopped and was ended. In fact, the very famous British historian Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, said at one point in one of his works, in a in a maybe an excess of romantic energy, he said that had the brave Frankish knights not stopped the Saracen hordes at Tours, then the sound of the minaret would today be sounding from Oxford spires. That is a little bit of an exaggeration. I think what happened to the Islamic expansion, and don't forget, we have an expansion here, and the Prophet died in 632, as I told you. In the space of 100 years, the Muslim armies moved as far west as Tours in France and as far east as India. And most of this was under the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. Most was achieved under the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus that I just mentioned to you. I think what you really had there was an advanced reconnaissance movement. You see, the problem with the Arab Empire at this point is it was too large. It had expanded too fast, and it really didn't have the infrastructure to survive. As soon as it had reached its maximum, it began to implode. It began to implode and fall in on itself, because in order to sustain an empire of that grandeur and that magnitude, you really need the logistics, the roads, the infrastructure, the communications. None of that was really present. But you might be, before I get into the cultural area of what I want to talk about, I want to give you a few more historical anecdotes, because I think this is a fascinating history that most people are unaware of. You might be interested to know that Arabs not only moved into the Riviera area, and Arabs who were originally desert tribesmen took very well to the sea and became buccaneers and pirates, the sea being very much like a desert, and the same sorts of military tactics can apply to sea warfare as desert warfare. They were very able buccaneers and so on, as we know from our own songs in the United States culture, the shores of Montezuma to the halls of Tripoli and so on, dealing with piracy, etc., of the 1700 period. They also moved into the Alps. There was a Belgian historian, Henri Pirenne, who wrote a book called Muhammad and Charlemagne, where he laid out his thesis that it was the Arab control of basically the Arab Sea. The Arabs made of the Mediterranean an Arab lake. They controlled all the islands, Majorca, Sardinia, Sicily, Crete, and so on. They had Spain. And basically the Mediterranean became an Arab lake. Southern European culture in a Western sense ceased. And even because of the control of certain passes in the Alps, there are Arab place names in the Alps, if you look. In the 800s, 900-year period, Pirenne's thesis was that this shifted the axis of Western civilization northward. And that whereas before Europe was dominated by the southern part of its culture and its framework, after the Arabs made of the Mediterranean a mammoth lake, the center of European civilization, he being a Belgian, wanted to think about how Belgium became important, shifted northwards, and this was represented in his mind by Charlemagne. So Northern Europe became, in his mind, the result of this Arab conquest that took over parts of Spain and the whole of the Mediterranean, etc., etc. There's some substance to his thesis, and if you look at it, Europe has never shifted since. Most of the strength and economic development and power of Europe has remained in the northern areas: France, Germany, the Low Countries, England, and so on. Where Spain is concerned, the pattern really doesn't hold so well. One last story, and that is, how did the Umayyad Caliphate shift to Spain? How did we get Umayyads, who had begun in Mecca, ended up in Damascus, finally coming to Cordoba in Spain? That is a tale of immense romanticism. The Umayyads were ultimately overthrown by another dynasty in the east called the Abbasids that took power in Baghdad. It was under the Abbasid that the Arab cultural achievement developed. And we'll talk about those Arab cultural achievements that moved to Spain, that formed the background of the Western cultural achievements that resulted in the Columbus voyages, in a moment. But in any event, this Abbasid Caliphate moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and in the process extirpated all the Umayyads who they blamed for being not good Muslims. The Umayyads were really Arab kings, not religious-minded Muslims in the exact sense of the word, and many religious-minded Muslims were disaffected and held this against them. So when the final reckoning came in 749, all the Umayyads were exterminated, and their graves were uprooted in Damascus. The whole was wiped out, except for one boy. His name was Abdurrahman, and he became known as Abdurrahman I. He was a teenager. The story goes that he and his freedman, Badr, were escaping across the Euphrates from the Abbasid police. He had his little brother with him, and they swam across the Euphrates River, but his little brother couldn't make it. And he watched the Abbasid police slaughter his brother on the opposite side of the river. Because his mother had been a Berber, a North African, he was smuggled across North Africa. Because the Arab tribesmen who had now settled in Spain in vast numbers, in fact, in the settlement of Spain by Arabs, you can find where a given Arab community settled. Arabs from Jordan or Transjordan, for instance, would settle in one Spanish city. Arabs from Syria in another. Arabs from the Medina area in a third city. Cities in Spain became known by the locale from where their Arab tribesmen came from. And these Arab tribesmen brought with them some of the old Arab feuds into Spain. The famous old feud was the Qais-Kalb feud. And this laid the foundation for the struggles between the different Arab cities there and the introduction of the Umayyad dynasty into Spain. When the Abbasids took over in Baghdad, the tribesmen in Spain were totally disaffected. And in 755, this Abdurrahman, now a young man, was introduced into the Arab tribesmen in Spain, and the Umayyad Caliphate resurrected itself in Spain, and the tribesmen rallied to him, and the Caliphate set down its capital at Cordoba. Cordoba is in southern Spain. The great Mosque of Cordoba, as you may know, is a tremendous architectural achievement. It's now the Christian Cathedral of Cordoba. In any event, the Umayyads ruled in Spain for another 300 years. So whereas they only ruled in Damascus for 80, they ruled in Spain for 300. And this was the cultural flowering of Islamic civilization in Spain under the Umayyads. Most of their flowering was in this southern area. Quickly review the Reconquista before we get to the movement of the culture from Baghdad into Spain. If you know about the Reconquista, by 1085, the Reconquista that started in northwest Spain had reached half point. Toledo fell, the classical capital of Spain. That was approximately 400 years from the initial Arab jump off into Spain. It took another 400 years before the final episode in the Reconquista, the fall of Granada in 1492. And you know that 1492 is the date of Columbus's voyage to America. So the date of Columbus's voyage to America, which you've no doubt covered in other lectures, coincides with the fall of the last Arab principality in Spain, the Principality of Granada. So you have a tremendous period of time in this Reconquista, but it too coincides with the events culminating in the Columbus episode. Let's go back to Baghdad. The Abbasids, who began what was called the Abbasid Caliphate, now in Baghdad, were known as the flowering of Islamic Arab culture. Under the Abbasids in Baghdad in the 800s, 3 translation centers were in activity supposedly almost constantly. In these translation centers, all the works of classical civilization were rendered into Arabic. And this was going on throughout the 800s and early 900s. Works like Ptolemy's astronomy, Euclid's algebra, or geometry rather. Algebra is even named after the Arab word algebra, and so on. All of the mathematical works, all of the astronomical treatises, all of the medical treatises, all of the philosophical treatises from classical Greece came into Arabic in Baghdad, particularly under the Abbasids. In time, all of this learning and knowledge moved over into Spain, particularly Umayyad Spain, from the 755 period to the late 1000s. So we have a tremendous cultural flowering under Islam, not just in philosophy and science, but also in literature, that many people are just unaware of. And many people are unaware of the fact that it was the Arabs and the Muslims who preserved, in many cases, Western culture. Certainly in the Byzantine Empire and in the Alexandria library previously, some of these works had flourished. But in Christendom as we know it, a lot of this sort of activity and speculation was not encouraged and often discouraged. If it existed at all, it was perhaps in a monastic library someplace, but not used to any extent. Whereas on the Arab side, the Arabs became totally enamored of Aristotle and Plato. They were translated into Arabic and they influenced Arabic thought, so that a whole group of Arab philosophers developed out of this translation activity, first in the Baghdad area, later on in Spain. Now, I could give you some of the names because they are so famous. I'll just run through a couple of the names so you know where this movement went. The first one was called Al-Kindi in the late 700s, Al-Farabi in the 900s. These are Platonic Aristotelian type Arab philosophers who are applying Platonic Aristotelian thought to Islamic religious ideas. In fact, it is the original scholastic synthesis. What you hear of as the scholastic synthesis of humanism in Italy in the 1300s, particularly associated with names like Thomas Aquinas, is not an original activity. Thomas Aquinas' books are basically a simple rehash of Al-Farabi, the Muslim philosopher of the 900s. And if you know Dante's work in the late 12th, early 1300s from Italy, the classical Italian poet, you will know that in his hell he reserved a space for enlightened people. In that enlightened people placed within hell, the inferno, he placed many of these Arab writers and philosophers that he himself had become acquainted with, including someone we're going to hear about momentarily, Averroes. Averroes in Arabic, Ibn Rushd. In any case, the line of philosophers. So you see, in Italy, even in the 1300s, these works were being translated and known and moving from Arabic into Latin, and I'll explain how that happened. So this line of philosophers, going through Al-Farabi, coming up to, in the next generation, Ibn Sina, a Persian philosopher, who wrote medical treatises, philosophical treatises, astronomical treatises, mystical treatises, etc. He's known in the West because when he was translated, they usually got a different name, as you may have heard of it, Avicenna. Ibn Sina in the West is Avicenna. All these people triggered Western humanism and the Western Renaissance as the translations came into the West. So Ibn Sina in the 1000s, and then finally the one I mentioned, the most famous one of all in the West, Ibn Rushd. He is from Cordoba. He is from Spain. He is an Arab Islamic philosopher, jurist from Spain. He is a total Aristotelian. He it is who's called in the West Avicenna, and he it is whose works were finally translated in the West. Now, the strange part about all of this is that the West seemed to have appreciated this current in Arab thought and philosophy more than the Arabs themselves ultimately did. Because around the 12 or 1300s, a kind of deadening began to take over the Islamic Arab Muslim world. And cultural achievements of this kind became rarer, and a certain freezing of thought and coagulation developed, probably because of theological tendencies that were more conservative. And much of this kind of work was discouraged. For instance, there was a big attack made on the philosophers by a man called Al-Ghazali, who wrote in favor of the mystic way, the Sufi way, Islamic mysticism. And Islamic mysticism gradually took over a good deal of practice throughout the Islamic world, and philosophical, i.e. Greek Western type of thinking was discouraged. Many of my Muslim friends say to me, well, when will we equal the West in culture and achievement? And often I respond, when you go the way of Averroes. For them, Averroes is an almost unknown philosopher, and yet the West has embraced him entirely. As I said, Western philosophers like Avicenna, Thomas Aquinas, and many others, their work is totally peppered with the work of people like Avicenna and Averroes, who originally made the scholastic synthesis upon which ultimately the Renaissance in the Western historical development is based. Let me just move over to the Jewish side of things so you know that the role that the Jews played in this. By this time, as I told you, there had been a cooperation of Jews and Arabs, and they were almost totally identified with each other. And the Jews so much adopted Arab Islamic culture that almost all their cultural works were written in Arabic. And the Jews also in this period in Iraq, later in Egypt, finally in Spain, began to write treatises of the Arabic kind. So you have a whole succession as well of Jewish philosophers and thinkers writing the same Aristotelian type theses. For instance, Sadiq Goyen in Mesopotamia or Iraq. And then ultimately in Spain a whole series of philosophers, some called Ibn Ezra, the most Judah Halevi, Ibn Gabirol, known in the West as Avicenna, but the most famous one was Maimonides. Maimonides was born in Spain. Ultimately, with the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate and the coming of more extreme, intolerant Muslim conquest groups from North Africa, people like Maimonides were forced to leave Spain in the 1200 period and made their way to Egypt. But Maimonides was the most famous of the Jewish philosopher thinkers. And he was basically born in Spain and came out of a Spanish cultural milieu. And Maimonides in the Crusades was Saladin's personal physician. And he was also associated with Richard the Lionhearted, who asked him to serve in some medical capacity on his behalf. In other words, many of these thinkers were Renaissance men, really Renaissance men, pre-Renaissance men, and they combine all of these cultural skills and mathematical and scientific skills in a single person. Now, another thing that the Jews in Spain did was, since they had translated all the Arabic treaties themselves into Hebrew, and there were co-religionists on the other side who knew Hebrew and Latin, often the Jews operated as the middlemen in the transference of the Arab cultural heritage that included the Greek cultural heritage back into the Western cultural heritage. And many of these philosophers are getting Hebrew-type names. Avi, for instance, is a Hebrew-type name, not an Arabic-type name. So there were translation centers, particularly in Catalonia, in Mallorca and Barcelona, in southern Italy, which was at that time dominated to a certain extent by Spain, in Naples, in Toledo, and other areas. There were translation centers, the opposite of the kind that had been going on in Baghdad in the 800s. Now in Spain, in the 11, 12, 1300s, in the wake of the Crusades and the interest in Eastern thought and so on, all of the scientific knowledge was pouring back into the West from the Western Islamic contact, particularly in the Reconquista in Spain. You see, when the Reconquista took 800 years, it was not a rapid conquest. It was a long-term affair with many peaks and valleys, many movements forward and many movements backwards. And what was going on there was a tremendous mixing of cultures. So much of this Christian, Islamic, Jewish mix of cultures was indistinguishable and going on in Spain. Now for the Jews in Spain, particularly under the Umayyads, but also later, the Umayyads collapsed, I think, around the 1080s, you can think of it, and then some more reactionary regimes came into the 1200 period. I don't want to burden you with their names. The Reconquista kept going, and as I said, was achieved finally in 1492. So you can visualize it in your mind what kind of progress that was making. But in this period, of Spain. This was known as the Golden Age of Spain for Jews. And as I told you, initially, and even when the Reconquista was achieved, many Spanish Christians blamed the Muslim presence to a certain extent on Jews. That the Jews had cooperated with the Muslims, had been involved with the Muslim conquest to a certain extent, and had benefited by the Muslim conquest. And it is true that the Jews flourished under Islam in Spain as nowhere else in their history since the fall of the temple, and maybe up to the present day, which is why it's looked upon as this beautiful golden age before the chapter slammed shut with the Columbus period of 1492. Now you have on the Jewish side an awful lot of cultural development, mostly in Arabic, but also in Hebrew. We have development in poetry, in philosophy, in mystic poetry, and this is happening on both sides of the border, which is shifting constantly, both in Christian and Muslim Spain. But it started in Muslim Spain, and then it moves on into Christian Spain because the division line between the two is constantly shifting, so it's hard to decide whether you're in Christian Spain or Muslim Spain when you're in the 1300 period. But also in scientific endeavor. And this directly relates to the Columbus voyages too. Because Jewish and Arab mathematicians, particularly on the Jewish side, were working on astronomical tables. The quadrant, for instance, was developed by a very famous, was further developed by a very famous Jewish philosopher in Muslim Spain called Ibn Ezra. You have the quadrant being worked on. You had this astrolabe, which made long sea voyages possible, being developed until it reached its zenith of development under a Jewish philosopher writer in Barcelona and in Majorca called, what was his name now? Zacuto, Abraham Zacuto. And he is someone who both Columbus and Vasco da Gama consulted. So these people were inventing and perfecting scientific instruments that were later being used in the voyages. So Abraham Zacuto is probably the most famous name, but there's a whole series of these people in the 1300s and 1400s. Another individual called Levi ben Gersonides, who was involved in the development of the astrolabe and also involved in working on astronomical charts. So they also perfected the astronomical charts that helped the voyagers in the long ocean voyages that they were going to embark on, because without the astronomical charts, which gave you the phases of the planets and the stars and the constellations and so on, and tied it to the date and the time of the year, etc., and then you would work with your quadrant and your astrolabe and these different instruments to pinpoint where you were. All of these long voyages were impossible. So you see how the cultural development moved on into these tremendous, rich developments of the kind we are talking about. It's an interesting episode that's told about some of these charts, Abraham Zacuto's charts, which in fact Columbus was using, that they were so precise. Now I don't know whether this is apocrypha or whether this is actually real, but they were so useful and so precise that at one point when Columbus was on one of his voyages and he was in some physical danger, he was able to frighten the local inhabitants by predicting a lunar eclipse of some kind. This sounds a bit apocryphal, but he supposedly was able to, on the basis of his charts, the very charts that these philosophers and thinkers were developing, he was able to predict an eclipse of some kind, and therefore threaten the local inhabitants that if they didn't stand down, there may be a further eclipse of the sun next time. So he was able to save himself by the usage of some of these charts. So as I said, on the Jewish side, you were getting this very great cultural development This cultural development moved into and developed from the translation from Arabic through Hebrew into Latin, and then the scientific knowledge that moved from Arabic either directly into Latin in some cases, but usually through Hebrew into Latin, was the kind of knowledge that fertilized the beginning of the Renaissance and the beginning of a new outlook in the West, where people were thinking in this way. I think what I would like to do is try to trace the end of the Islamic presence in Spain and the final expulsion of the Jews and the Arabs, which was a very sad episode, as you probably know. With the final conquests, Ferdinand and Isabella had unified the whole of Spain. I think by the 1200s, most of Spain had fallen, except for the southern section, Granada. And have any of you seen pictures of this city? It's a fabulous city with fountains and marvelous architecture and so on. Most of it had fallen except Granada. And then with the fall of Granada in 1492, the fate of the Jews and the Arabs was sealed. Now you might want to ask the question, why were the Jews and the Arabs expelled from Spain, or the Muslims? Well, I'm not sure how many Muslims actually were expelled from Spain. It looks like quite a number converted to Christianity, and that is a long study in Christian-Arab origins in the cultural study of Spain. But quite a few Jews, we have the records of, did leave Spain. I think, in the hundreds of thousands perhaps. Quite a few probably were also converted. Again, if you ask the question, why was this? In my mind, it's very simple. It's just the old Visigothic intolerance reasserted itself once the Reconquista was completed. I don't know if that's a sufficient explanation for you, but you have to realize that the Jews and the Muslims were both being expelled. What the numbers really were isn't clear. And the strange thing about the run-up to Columbus's voyages is that the actual date of Columbus' departure, and I don't know what the resonance of this might be, was the actual date, the scheduled departure of Columbus, was the actual last day for particularly the Jews. I'm not sure if the same date was for the Muslims. Particularly the Jews was the last date for them to leave Spain. Now you can say, well, how did this happen? I mean, you didn't just leave overnight. I think they had a 3-month waiting period. But the date of Columbus's departure was the end of that 3-month, preparation waiting period. And Columbus is said to have noted in his diaries some of these ships in the harbor here leaving. Now, there were also Jewish people who seemed to be involved to a certain extent in Columbus's voyages, as you may know, and some of the people who were behind the financing in the Spanish court were of Marrano background. Marrano, do you know what that means, Marrano? Marrano were people who were converted to Christianity, but had not yet completed that conversion in their souls and were keeping the Jewish practices in a private way. So you had some Marrano people who were cooperating and backing these voyages with their financing. And many people have said, was Columbus himself, or suggested, was he himself a secret Jew, or what was he of a Jewish background? This is something that has been debated, and I am not able to add further light to the subject. I can only say that it has been suggested. Some have accepted it, some have rejected it. His origins in general are very obscure, and a lot of it has been said that Colon was a known Marrano Jewish name among some people, but that's as far as the speculation has gone. I mean, Columbus himself, by his own diary, shows himself to be an extremely Christian-minded person. So the question is whether he's committed completely in his soul, or whether this is just an intellectual facade that he has kept up. Whether a facade or a complete commitment, he certainly acted along those lines. So I don't really think that we can go very far with the idea of the Jewish complete background of Columbus. But certainly the timing of the voyage seems to be really coincidental in terms of the kinds of things that we have seen happening here. Keeping on the Jewish tax there, what were the Jews seeking? Well, many, in trying to answer this question for the financing, the answer to the question, I think, would be quite simple. They may have been interested in financing this for business purposes, but in fact they may have been seeking refuge somewhere. And it has been speculated that these sorts of voyages and the backing and being interested in voyages of this kind were directly connected to the situation of being expelled from Spain. So this is something you'll have to think about yourselves, whether you think there is a connection. There's no direct evidence that can pinpoint that Jewish people or Marrano-Jewish people were involved not only in the cruise but in the financing of these kinds of voyages in order to find themselves a future sheltering place, which in fact happened to some of them, or whether this is just mythology. That's something that you will have to speculate about yourself. I'm not able to enter into the mindset of most of these people. So I think, to sum up, I think we can give the conclusions of what happened to the Jewish-Muslim presence in these areas. As far as the Muslim side of things, Muslim life really came to an end in Spain, and this tremendous flowering that we saw there, leading up to people like, as I said, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, another great Muslim sociological thinker, Ibn Khaldun. He too was set in motion by these events and ended up not in Spain but in Egypt and Syria, and working for the Mongols, of all people, in the late 1400s. So great Muslim thinkers also were set adrift by this Reconquista process in Spain. Great Jewish thinkers too, as I said, were set adrift. Many went to Cairo. A lot of them even, or some were reputed to have ended up in Jerusalem itself. This very famous Spanish Arab Jewish poet called Yehuda Halevi, the mythology, who wrote in Arabic, wrote his philosophical treatises in Arabic, wrote some of his poetry in Arabic. It is said that he too was on his way to Jerusalem. This was in the 1100s, in the dislocations earlier, when he met his death in an unknown manner. Even this individual, Abraham Zakuta, whom I mentioned to you, the one who was involved in the astrolabe, the one who perfected a metal astrolabe, the one who was involved in the charts and the scientific charts of the astronomical tables and so on that were used by the navigators. Even this individual originally left in 1492. In 1497, the Jews were expelled from Portugal. He had gone to Portugal and had taken part in the navigational activities in Portugal for 5 years. Then he ended up adrift in North Africa, and the stories go, and I don't know if it is true or not, he ended up in Jerusalem also. So you see, you have this constant stream of these kind of people out, and this really is the cultural background that led to Columbus's voyages. I really can't focus it completely on Columbus's voyages without saying a little bit more about the Renaissance and the modern development of the inquisitive mind in the Western world. As you know, you have the developments under, which I already mentioned, in the humanistic period in Italy, embodying themselves with Aquinas and Dante and others of that mind. But it was the movement of these texts also into Italy that slowly evolved into what we call the Renaissance mind. So really, this translation process that started in Baghdad in the 800s, went on into Spain in the 12 and 1300s, on into Italy thereafter, really did, in a unique way, trigger what we call Western civilization and Western culture. Well, I think I would like to break off there, and I will step out for a moment, and we'll take your questions later. Thank you. If any of you have any questions, I'd like to take them now. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, where did you say most of the Moors came from, the Arabs that went into?
Well, I'm glad you bring me back to that question, talking about Arabs and Moors. Remember, we distinguish between Arabs and Moors. Well, the Arabs, the center of Arab culture and civilization is what we call the Arabian Peninsula. And there are other Arabs that branch out from that in Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and so on. But that would really be the Arab area, and it's defined by language. Some people ask, what is an Arab? Well, it really isn't a genealogical definition. It can become that. Because you see, even Arabs acknowledge that there are Christian Arabs, or even they say there are Jewish Arabs. As far as they're concerned, I think what an Arab is on the whole someone who speaks Arabic. It's the best definition you can have is someone who speaks American English, ultimately. You know, even if you're not a daughter of the American Revolution, or you didn't come on the Mayflower, so you speak American English. What an Arab is someone who speaks Arabic. So you have that area for the Arab cultural inheritance. You have the North African, West African area for the Moroccan. Now, as the Arab armies flow over that area, they bring Arab culture and customs and religious ideas with them, so it's almost impossible to distinguish between Moors and Arabs, although I think in the Middle Ages they did distinguish between them. And Moors were really Moors, and Arabs were really more Eastern sort of people. Moors were more, I think, West African people. But all of these people contribute to the influx into Spain, and this influx is quite a massive influx, apparently because of the facts that I quoted to you before about all of these different cities that came from different Arab areas, and were actually had tribal affiliations going back to the Middle East. So when this Umayyad candidate, this Umayyad Caliph Abdurrahman I, who started this fantastic dynasty, came in there, well then they had the allegiances going back to the Middle East, and they'd already been settled there for some time. What I didn't cover in my previous talk, what I wanted to tell you a little bit about was the Umayyad achievements. And you had in this Cordoba was a center of Umayyad culture. You had very great architectural achievements, art, literature. So you really did have a tremendous flowering in this transfer, for some reason, of Arab culture into Spain, and nobody really knows why. Under the Visigoths previously, you don't seem to have had it. And maybe it was the Arab culture in southern Spain was an extremely tolerant one, and it may have been this tolerant culture that added to these kinds of flowerings. Yeah.
I had a question as far as the Jewish area was concerned. Why? I understand when they, in 1492, when the Muslims were expelled, but I'm still unsure of exactly why the Jews were, and then later in 1497 when they were expelled from Portugal.
Oh,
were they feeling some kind of religious threat or something?
The Jews were the original ones expelled. I think the Muslims were really expelled as kind of like an afterthought. I don't think the Muslims were, as I said, I don't really want to think that the Inquisition, I think, was more directed against Jews than Muslims, because for whatever reason, and it's not an insult or a compliment, more Muslims seem to have been absorbed into the Spanish polity. A lot of Jews were too, but the Muslims don't seem to have left in the kind of numbers that the Jews did. The expulsion was directed against Jews and Muslims together, but if you converted, you could stay. And I think on the whole, superficially, a good deal of the population of the agricultural population was prepared to stay, and they would be Muslim husbandmen, villagers, and so on. I don't think you got vast groups of villagers leaving. You might also say that the Jews were more capable of leaving, since they did come from an international community, in the sense that they had co-religionists in all cities along North Africa, in Egypt, in other places in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. They could maybe make the connections that made it possible for them to leave. You know, many of the Jews who left Spain went to the Balkans, of all places, because the Turks had recently conquered Constantinople in 1453. And they threw open, whereas the walls of Spain were closed, the walls of the Ottoman Empire were open. And many of these Jews went and settled originally in Constantinople or Istanbul, and then spread out into different Balkan cities. And the Greek city, that you may have heard of, Saloniki, was very largely a Jewish city, with Jewish longshoremen and everything. And they spoke a kind of strange Judeo-Arabic tongue, a Judeo-Spanish tongue. And the Jews called it Ladino. They spoke the tongue of Spain in the Balkans for many centuries. That community, by the way, was more or less wiped out under Hitler in the last century. But they spoke this Ladino. So I think a lot of the Jews did go to these other areas. You ask about Portugal. Well, the Spanish regulations were not applied in Portugal until 1497 for some reason. And then the regulations that had been applied in Spain also were applied in Portugal. So that 5-year lapse was the reason for what the reason for that 5-year lapse was only because Portugal was still an open country. And 5 years later, the expulsions, for some reason, I don't know what the political manipulations or negotiations were that brought that about, but Portugal also was closed. I would like to add one thing about the Inquisition. You know, the Inquisition was a way of ferreting out people who were not true Christians. People who had, it wasn't really a way of punishing outsiders, it was a way of punishing or looking into people who were superficial Christians but had not really become Christian and had not taken Christianity to their heart. And that's why you have the tortures and all the other things associated with it. If a person would recant and so on, you could probably survive the Inquisition to a certain extent, but extensive questions and that kind of thing were given to people, and the examinations were quite thorough and quite often quite brutal. But the Inquisition was part and parcel of the expulsion, because the Inquisition was aimed at getting at people who hadn't left, who either should have left, or who had falsely converted, or who had sympathies of a kind that were not tolerated to the official authorities. Strangely enough, that too was transported to the Americas and applied on Indians. I think the Indians were the last people that anyone would have thought the Inquisition applied to, and yet those apparatuses that were dealing with the situation in Spain then became transported to America and applied to people who had really nothing to do with it at all. And I think in some parts of the Americas, I'm not an expert on the Inquisition in the Americas, but in some parts probably the effects were quite devastating. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I appreciate your attendance, and I hope that you continue your studies in a rich manner. Thank you.
Statement that you brought up, or the thesis of Henri Pirenne about the way in which Arab culture moved through Europe and the devastating consequences, in a sense, for Southern Europe that forever lost its hegemony in the Mediterranean.
Southern Europe has never recovered. In fact, that is what's so interesting about the Pirenne thesis. He may not be completely right. No one is always completely right. But what's so fascinating is that he did pinpoint the reason, I think, for the decline of Southern European culture, hegemony, and dominance. Because before that, all we ever heard about Europe was Italian culture, Greek culture, Spanish culture, and anything north of the Alps was unheard of. And what he does is he shows that not only did the Arabs turn the Mediterranean into an Arab lake by the sea activity. And you know, an interesting sideline to that I've often pointed out to students that might interest your viewers is that if you look at European cities, none of them are on the seacoast. All the principal European cities are inland, up rivers. If you look at American cities, like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New Orleans, they're all on the seacoast. We don't have any marauder raiders, pirates in the United States culture area. The Atlantic Ocean is too big, but in Europe, the Mediterranean, Rome is inland. The principal Spanish cities are inland.
Absolutely.
France, Paris is up the Seine. It wasn't just the Arab raiders in the south. You had the Viking raiders in the north. All London is inland. There are no European cities to speak of that are on the coast. None whatsoever. So this closing off of the Mediterranean, both through piratical activity and also the interesting point that you discover is that for a while commerce was even interrupted in the Alps. That you just didn't get the passage from north and south, and the center of European life, the axis switched to the north. This is his thesis, and this is what he thought Charlemagne represented, Charlemagne being a northern European king, a Franco-German king. And I think there's a lot of truth there. He does explain a lot, and of course, as you say, the south never recovered, and the north has been dominant since.
No, I mean, it's fascinating because as a professor of literature and thinking of my own studies in the Middle Ages and the Romance language Middle Ages, we constantly come across the menacing Arabic type, the Saracens and all the literature, but it's fascinating. It's the first time I've ever heard anything about why, and then an historical thesis for it. And
this is my thesis, of course.
I realize that, but it really puts the European world back into contact, I mean, through the things you've been talking about, back into contact with the Arabic world, which leads me to my next question is, why the blackout? I mean, why in European studies do we not broach this topic so much at the beginning?
That's a very interesting question. I wish some of your students had asked me that, because it's such a rich question in the sense that you do have a blackout. You know, a lot of people don't understand Dante's sweet new style. Dante's sweet new style is the Arab poetry of Spain of 2 centuries before. We have Ibn Hazm, who is writing about amore. Everything for him is amore.
Romance philologists don't say that, though.
And this moves from Spain. The whole chivalrous ethic, the chivalrous idea comes from Umayyad Spain, and on through the poetry into troubadour poetry of southern France, then on into Italy. So all of that flows from, I don't want to make too much of it, but all you have to do is read the Umayyad poets of southern Spain, and you know the Arab ethic of not touching women and so on. You have this admiration from afar. It is all the basis of the chivalric ethic, and you're first getting this amore love poetry in, of all places, 1000s Cordoba, Spain. And the, of course, master of this is Ibn Hazm. Now, they don't do it in philosophy either. Philosophy and science, all you hear about is the scholastic synthesis. And a student is brought up to think that everything begins with Aquinas and so on. Aquinas is an interesting thinker. But I have to be frank. There is nothing original in Aquinas' work. It is all in Maimonides, and not just Maimonides, Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Farabi before him. In other words, it's been that kind of thinking has been going on for 300 or 400 years prior to that in a Arabo-Jewish environment, particularly an Arabic philosophical environment, starting in Baghdad with the cultural translations of the Arab manuscripts. You know, another interesting thing, just in taking Arabic civilization, and I sketch the history very, very fast, but these little anecdotes are illustrative. The Mamluks. It is really a word in Arabic, to be owned by the state, to be possessed by these states. The Mamluks stopped the Mongols in Palestine, which is why Arab civilization switched to Egypt. All of the Arab world on the other side of that, in Iraq and Syria, were devastated, and they never recovered. But the Mamluks were the group that stopped the Mongols in Palestine, a very famous battle in the late 1250s. they were brought up on Platonic philosophy. It is quite likely that the whole Mamluk idea of a slave class that becomes the leader and the warriors is based on Plato's Republic. All this is part of the movement of Greek ideas into Arabic. It's very curious.
I'd like to go back to that earlier thesis about the earlier idea about European culture shifting north with the
Closing off of the Mediterranean.
With the closing off of the Mediterranean. If I were a young fellow about to do a PhD in history, I would certainly like to look into this area, but I would like to bring a series of questions to it. And one is, does this shift jibe with the development of commercial agriculture and later the industrial and later the development of commerce? Does it jibe with Protestantism, with the schism between?
I'm sure all of it could be linked in. I mean, I haven't thought in those terms, but that's where your young researchers could move the Perrin thesis. And I don't know what young Belgian or European scholars have done with that. After all, Perrin was a Belgian nationalist, and he wanted to show why, after all, Brussels is the center of the common market today, you know.
And I would particularly want to deal with this idea from the point of view of, is Europe rejecting the possibility of a multicultural Europe in the Mediterranean and moving in the direction of a type of cultural purity that then can be located in the north where there
I think at this time that happened, yes. I think at this time the Charlemagne ethic, you know, united Germanic and Franco groups. It was a Franco-German, that's what was called the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah. I think Perrin is very good on the question of Charlemagne. You know, Charlemagne actually had physical contacts with the Caliph of Baghdad. There were deputations exchanged with Harun al-Rashid, the fabulous Caliph of Baghdad of the 800 period, about whom the Arabian Nights is written. There are deputations back and forth. They were both very much aware of themselves. The point I wanted to bring up that is interesting again for your students and viewers, that is to show how deep this Franco-German idea got into the Arab mind. Today, even today, foreigners are called throughout the Arab world Frangies. That is Franks, Frankies, Frenchies. Because of this whole thing that the Franks, the Charlemagne and thereafter, and then the Norman Knights, who were part of the Crusades, the Norman Knights first take England in 1066, then Toledo, 1085, Jerusalem, the First Crusade, 1099, all of that were Norman endeavors. You have a tremendous Norman expansion. They have all these as Frenchies, as Francos, as Franks, Frangies, and today the word for foreigner in the Arab world is Frangi. An American who goes to the Arab world, you're just a Frangi.
So do we find this in their literature as well?
Frangies?
Yeah, I mean the whole literature of the enemy.
Oh yeah, oh sure. They have literature from the Crusades on the other side, which portrays the Crusaders as brutes, as uncivilized, ill-mannered, vulgar and brutal animals. And yes, the antagonism is there, and the contempt, the cultural contempt. Because at that time, I think the Eastern culture and the Arab culture, both in the Middle East and in Spain, was on a higher, at least more delicate level. What happened? Because I think the Germanic, French, knight, bastion, noble, baron sort of culture was quite rough and crude, and that's been portrayed in movies and literature. But they saw themselves on a much higher level, and I think what happened is that this freeze did occur around 1200 in the Arab Muslim world. Of course, the Muslims would not want to admit that. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings on that regard, but there was a certain decision to stop moving forward culturally and to follow other ways, mystic ways, which is fun or interesting for individual spiritual fulfillment, but doesn't do much for scientific achievement. And I really do think, had the Muslims decided to go the way of Averroes, then we really might have had, minarets in the Oxford spires.
Let me ask you another historical question. You brought up a very interesting point with the intolerance of the Visigoths.
Very intolerant.
Just where did they come from, and where does this particular intolerance stem from within this group?
I don't know. I mean, I don't blame them personally. They were newly created by probably very zealous, clerical, monkish type people. And so I don't want to blame these poor tribesmen for this intolerance. the only explanation I was able to give, like that all new converts, they tend to lack the sort of traditional, sort of more easygoing attitude towards the religion and culture that they're adopting, and they seem to be extremely zealous. And maybe when you have a teacher and you're a new convert, you're more prepared to do what that zealous teacher wants you to do than if you have your own cultural flexibility. Like if you come from Mexico, let's say, you're used to many different cultures. There's a certain cultural flexibility there. You're not going to be taken in by some new zealous movement to be totally intolerant. It's going to take much more than that. But a new tribe, like these Visigoths, who became the nobles. You see, in Europe, you have basically a Germanic nobility. You always have for a long period of time, not just from the Charlemagne period, but also in Spain. I mean, you've always had this kind of blonde-haired Germanic upper class in Spain. Coming back to the Visigoths, of course, the present king is exactly the same way. It's just surprising. I don't want to get spin racialist theories about that, but the mass of Spanish people, the farming people, are often of different cultural background. This upper class has always been Teutonic.
Well, it's also
in a
true
strange
that,
way.
I mean, a lot of the literary figures, I mean, Cervantes himself, when they trace Spanish identity, they trace it to these Visigoths.
They do, they really? I wasn't aware of
Yes, they do. It's very interesting.
See, I'm not that
in Cervantes' first work, which is a play, where he talks about
does. Well, there you are.
and the Spaniard is this Visigoth type.
Well,
who then, and it's interesting the way later on Spanish identity is created and constructed, which leads me, in a sense, to the next question. We talked a lot about the literary tradition of the carrying over of the Crusades into literature. And one of the lectures that we've had spoke a lot about the fashioning of the conquistador on the European crusader type of figure who goes off to the new world and conquers and takes over in the same way, much as we find in the Reconquista and the trying to take over of Jerusalem and
well, you have in Spain this very long Reconquista, as you know, and the El Cid episodes and legends and so on are part of that. So I think you have this pattern for the crusading knight in Spain, because a lot of people don't realize that the Reconquista was driven by the crusader ethic, and that many of these foreign knights were in fact part of it, and that ended up in 1492 in the way we know, and then was exported in a new, more contemporary way in the way you're describing.
Patrick Sales, whose book Conquest of Paradise we're reading for this course.
Well, you were talking about Cornell. He was at college with me at Cornell. We were in the same class.
That's fascinating. You were
the same class of 1958, right? So we were all there. You were mentioning you were going to be reading about Thomas Pynchon, I thought, in your introduction, but you didn't get to it. We were all there together, so we all knew each other. And it's interesting to know that he's been so successful.
What a group of contemporaries you made there, Thomas Pynchon.
Well, they were all. It was a big rabble-rousing period.